Hi everybody, Jerry Verwey here, Science Consultant at Kent ISD, and I'm responding to some of your questions that you've had about a 4th grade Next Generation Science Standard, specifically Life Science 1-2. Now that standard states, use a model to describe that animals receive different types of information through their senses, process the information in their brain, and respond to the information in different ways. Now, my goal here is to break this Next Generation Science Standard into two pieces to help us better understand what it's actually saying. The first part will be the part that we read, use a model. And that tells us what our students will be doing with this standard. And the second part would be where it says animals receive different types of information on through to the end of the standard. And that will describe what our students are learning through this standard. Now, most of you already know that the Next Generation Science Standards are based on the National Research Council's framework for K-12 science education, and that framework tells us what it means to be proficient in science as a body of knowledge, and that science should be evidence-based and model and theory-building processes that extend our students' knowledge. And to do this, 3 dimensions have been incorporated into each standard, and those dimensions are the science and engineering practices, the core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts. Now, within that first dimension, the scientific and engineering practices, there's 8 different practices throughout all the next-gen standards. Developing and using models is one of those practices, and as you can see highlighted in our standard, that's the one we're kind of looking at here. Constructing and using models is a practice that's helpful in representing both scientific and engineering ideas and explanations. Now, I have found throughout my classroom visits that oftentimes it's the wording of the standard that inhibits the understanding of the standard. For example, a teacher might not know what it means to model this particular type of behavior, or they might know what a model is but not how to apply it to the content idea here. So what I've done is I've created a list of some possible models that could be used for this particular standard. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some possibilities. So what I'll do is I'll explain these models first, and then I'll show you some examples of how they could be tied in to explain the content. So we could use diagrams, drawings, replicas, they could be mathematical representations, models can be analogies, or they could be computer simulations. Now, these models could be something that you provide your students to manipulate, or your students could create these models themselves. It would just depend on the approach that you want to take for a particular standard. Now, I have a picture here of a toy battleship, and that is a picture of a toy battleship that belonged to my grandfather. And he served on the USS New Jersey in World War II, and as a kid he would often tell me stories about his time in the war. What he did was he bought this model and used it to help explain to me where he was on the ship and how things worked on the ship. And that model provided me a visual of how things were actually occurring on that boat back in his time in the service. Now, this same principle applies to this standard. We're going to have these models that are going to allow our students to have a better visual picture of exactly what's happening as animals sense information and interpret how to react to that in their environment. Now, the second part of the standard states that animals receive different types of information through their senses, process it in their brain, and then respond to the information in different ways. So let's look at what that second half of the standard means. It's helpful first to think about the various senses that humans and other animals have available to them to survive in their environment. You've got touch, you've got hearing, smell, sight. All are senses that are bombarding the animal brain with all this sensory information constantly. The goal of this standard is to learn how these senses are detected by specialized receptors and how animals use this information to respond accordingly. Now, within the Next Generation Science Standards, if you were to view Appendix E, which I will show you a link to later on, at the very bottom here where it says Life Science 1.D Information Processing, we can see what our students should be learning at the 3rd through 5th grade level. You can also see what they had learned previous to 4th grade in the K through 2 level. So kindergarten through 2nd grade, they were looking at how animals sense and communicate information and respond to inputs with behaviors that help them grow and survive. Now we're looking at, in the 4th grade, how different sense receptors are specialized for particular kinds of information, and how animals use their perceptions and memories to guide their actions. So again, that was from Appendix E. Now, I have touch receptors in my skin. So I'll kind of explain what this means at the 4th grade level. I have these touch receptors in my skin, and we call them nerves. And they can detect heat from a hot plate when I go to try to grab one out of a microwave. Now, these receptors signal my brain that the plate is hot, and this perception, combined with my memories of previous experiences with hot items, causes me to avoid touching the plate. So this would be one example of specialized receptors, which we have right down here, specialized receptors, which signal information to my brain, and then my brain uses that information combined with my previous memories to decide how to react to that. So that would be one example of an application of this particular standard. And there are many others. Let me give you a few other examples. You could have your students examine diagrams of how light enters the eye, and the students can investigate why a person suddenly squints when they're confronted by a bright light. Or maybe another way to approach the standard would be to have your students build toy drums to mimic the workings of an eardrum and understand how sound waves are able to elicit a response in animals. Perhaps another idea to try would be, you can see I have a GIF going on here of a flip book, and this is something that students would probably love to do, and maybe some teachers too, where you could create flip books and investigate the phenomenon of animation and understand how that sense received in your brain creates this illusion of animation. Or maybe you could have your students measure swim rate of goldfish in a fish tank, and they can investigate how water temperature affects the fish. So there's a lot of possibilities here for how you could apply this particular standard. So what I would say is, look at, is there an example that I gave here that might be fun for you to work with your students through? And then what sort of model do you want to use with that? And is that going to be a model that you provide to them? Or is it going to be a model that your students create themselves? Now, to provide you with some additional resources to help you with this standard, for those who have access to Edify, I've created a lesson in Edify which further details some approaches that you could take. Through this lesson, the primary resource video is kind of an extension of this particular video where I provide a little bit more in-depth detail on some examples of models as well as other ideas for teaching the standard in your classroom. There's a quick synopsis of everything I've explained here in the lesson summary. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, I provided some additional resources to help you to teach this standard in your classroom, including a sample lesson plan right here from out in San Diego that incorporates this particular life science 4th grade standard. So I hope this helped. If you have any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, have fun.